The sky above the Vermont hills was a washed-out blue, fading toward gray as the late September sun slid lower. In Sharon Connencade's kitchen, the clock's steady ticking was louder than it should have been, filling the gaps between unanswered phone calls. She'd been telling herself for hours that there was a simple explanation: bad cell service, a dead battery, a delay leaving the campground. But the longer the silence stretched, the harder it was to believe. It had been 2 days since her 17-year-old son, Rhett, had left with Odessa Vance, his girlfriend. They'd told both families they were going to Green Mountain National Forest, to a popular, well-patrolled campground that both mothers approved of reluctantly. In Odessa's case, it was supposed to be a safe choice, full of other campers, park staff, and the gentle kind of wilderness where a late-night campfire meant roasted marshmallows instead of real danger. But now it was Sunday evening, and they were overdue. Not by minutes, by hours. Sharon had tried Rhett's phone at least 20 times that afternoon. Every call went straight to voicemail. She'd called Odessa's number too, with the same result. She told herself it was just Vermont's patchy coverage. She told herself a lot of things. At 6:02 p.m., she gave up pretending. She grabbed her keys from the hook by the back door, barely aware of locking the house behind her. The drive to the campground was long and winding. The pavement slick in patches where the last rain had clung stubbornly in dips and cracks. The windshield, the forest loomed, green turning gold, gold fading toward rust. The first breath of autumn, edging every leaf. The ranger station at the campground entrance was still staffed when she arrived. She pulled into the gravel lot and stepped out, feeling the damp air close in around her. The ranger behind the counter looked up from a clipboard, his expression politely neutral. "My son," she said quickly, "and his girlfriend. They were supposed to be camping here this weekend. Rhett Connencaide and Odessa Vance." He flipped through the registration log, fingers sliding down the columns. Then again and again, slower. He looked up, a faint crease between his brows. "They're not here," he said. "No record of them checking in." Sharon's stomach went cold. "Maybe they came in late," she said, voice tight. "Skip the booth?" The ranger hesitated, then shook his head. "I can't rule it out, but I'd notice a Jeep like you're describing." She drove the loops herself after that, headlights sweeping over each campsite, searching for the old Jeep's square silhouette, for the yellow glow of a lantern inside a tent. Nothing. Only empty picnic tables, smoldering fire pits, the last of the weekend families packing up for home. By the time she pulled back onto the road, her hands were shaking. She called Odessa's mother, Jacqueline, from the dark cab of her car. The two women's voices were tight with worry by the time they agreed to meet at the local police station. Inside, under the cold hum of fluorescent lights, they told the officers everything they could. The text Sharon had gotten Friday afternoon was the last contact from Rhett, a selfie of him and Odessa huddled together in warm clothes, a shallow cave wall rising behind them. "Heading out now. See you Sunday." It wasn't Green Mountain National Forest behind them. It wasn't anywhere Sharon recognized. The officers took down the details. But when they realized the teenagers hadn't even gone to their stated destination, the tone shifted. The search wouldn't be a matter of checking a few easy trails. The area was now potentially hundreds of square miles of trackless wilderness. That night, the Vermont State Police mobilized search-and rescue teams. Volunteers and professionals combed the areas closest to where they should have been, calling their names into the damp, echoing dark. K-29 units worked the undergrowth, but the rain and the vastness of the terrain swallowed every scent. By the third day, even the initial optimism was gone. The Jeep hadn't turned up in any lot, pull-off, or trailhead. The phones had gone dead shortly after leaving their hometown Friday. The search was starting from nothing. It was an uncle, not a friend, who gave investigators their first reel. Lead Barry Connencaide mentioned that Rhett had borrowed his old Garmin handheld GPS just a few days earlier, the kind you plug into a computer to load maps, meant for deep wilderness navigation far from cell towers. When the police took Barry's desktop computer and pulled the sync logs, the mood in the room shifted. Coordinates popped up on the monitor, plotted into a jagged, deliberate route that had nothing to do with Green Mountain National Forest. The points drew a line northeast, straight toward one of the most remote, sparsely populated areas in Vermont. The Northeast Kingdom, by the time they overlaid the route on a topographical map. The truth was clear. The kids had lied from the start. They'd been aiming for a place few people ever saw, let alone camped in. Sharon stared at the map when they showed her. All she could see was empty space and contour lines climbing into steep ridges. Jacqueline's voice was sharper, angrier. Why would they go there? No one had an answer. The search shifted north, into terrain where even experienced hikers thought twice before venturing without a guide. Helicopters were useless under the canopy. On the ground every mile took. Hours, days, turned into weeks. Autumn stripped the leaves from the trees. The teams kept pushing until the cold drove them back. By mid-November, the search was officially scaled down. The families were left with silence. Then, December, a geological surveyor named Wyatt Pendergast cut across an unmarked section of forest while mapping old mine shafts. In a clearing ringed with pine, he saw a sagging yellow dome tent, mottled with mildew and leaf litter. Water bottles, a cold fire pit, damp clothes strung between two trees. At first he thought it was illegal dumping. He took photos, marked the coordinates, and planned to report it. It took him hours to hike out and find cell service the next day. Trooper Miller hiked in, expecting to find someone for abandoned gear. He unzipped the tent and found a backpack with a wallet inside. The ID read, Rhett, Con, Inc. Aid. By the time the crime scene team arrived, the forest was quiet enough to hear every step on the sodden ground. They cataloged everything. The sleeping bags, the wrappers, the ash in the fire ring, near the fire pit. Half buried in leaves, an investigator spotted a flash of green and yellow, a crumpled package labeled Stony Patch High-Potency Cannabis. Edibles theories began before the evidence bags were even sealed. If the kids had eaten them, maybe they'd gotten disoriented. Maybe they'd wandered into the ravine. Maybe a bear had come. Or maybe not. Because 150 yards from the tent, near a sheer drop, they found Rhett's glasses frames snapped. One lens shattered. No body. No tracks. And on an overgrown logging. Road half a mile away, under a ledge that had shielded the ground from rain, they found tire impressions. Not Jeep tires. Not a TV. Narrow, aggressive tread. The kind used on specialized off-road utility vehicles. The quiet of the clearing had changed. It wasn't just empty anymore. It felt watched. The cast of the tire tracks sat on the evidence table under the harsh light of the Vermont State Police Forensics Lab. Pale plaster filled every groove, perfectly preserving the narrow, aggressive tread pattern. Beside it lay a stack of high-resolution photographs, each labeled with GPS coordinates, date, and time. Detective Marlowe leaned over them, her expression tight. "This is not recreational," she said finally. "This is something built to go where trucks can't." Nodded. "Matches nothing in our state database. Not an ATV, not any consumer UTV I've seen, and the size, narrow axle width. Someone modified this." The room went quiet for a moment. Marlowe straightened. "And this was half a mile from the campsite." "Yes, ma'am," the tech said. "Protected from rain, so we can't age them exactly, but leaf litter above the track says before mid-October. Could be the weekend they vanished." The presence of a third-party human, equipped, and in that exact remote stretch of forest, was no longer theory. It was physical fact. The problem was in the Northeast Kingdom. A lot of people had reasons to drive where the roads didn't go: hunters, poachers, loggers, and others. Marlowe requested a consult with U.S. Customs and Border Protection, knowing their northern Vermont unit had eyes and ears on everything that moved near the Quebec line. 2 days later, she and Sergeant Hensley sat in a cramped CBP field office, the scent of burnt coffee in the air. The agent studied the tread photos without hesitation. "Yeah," one of them said, tapping the printout. "We've seen this before. Not a farm rig. This is a specialized border runner. Smugglers use M, small frame, low noise, enough clearance to carry product over rock and mud without getting stuck. "What kind of product?" Hensley asked, though he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. The agent's mouth flattened. "Could be anything. Narcotics. Firearms. People." The words hung there, heavier than the gray sky outside. It changed the scope instantly. This wasn't just about two kids lost in the woods. If those tracks belonged to someone moving illicit goods across the border, and Rhett and Odessa had camped right in their path, the possibilities narrowed in a way no one wanted to think about. In the family's homes, the shift in tone filtered down slowly. Sharon heard it in the pauses when detectives called. Jacqueline heard it in the way officers stopped talking about lost hikers and started saying persons of interest. By January, the official search teams were gone. What remained? Was the investigation long hours of combing through digital records, re-interviewing friends, and tracing every scrap of physical evidence from the clearing? The stony patch packaging became a focal point. In 2018, Vermont's cannabis laws were loosening. But high-potency, commercial edibles, especially in that brand, were still coming in through illicit channels. After weeks of quiet questioning among the teenagers' circles, a name surfaced, a low-level local dealer who sold 2 high school kids. He was picked up, sat in a small interview room, and shown photos of Rhett and Odessa under pressure. He admitted he'd sold the stony patch bag to Rhett 3 days before the trip. But he added something that made Marlowe lean forward. "They weren't just looking to get high," he said. "Rhett told me they were meeting somebody, some guy they'd been talking to online. Said it was about living off-grid." The phrase lit up every nerve in the room. A digital forensics sweep of Rhett's laptop uncovered threads on obscure survivalist forums. Between talk of water filtration and makeshift shelters, there were private messages with a user known only by a pseudonym. The language was persuasive, almost charismatic. It framed modern society as broken beyond repair, praised the virtues of total seclusion, and spoke of a small, hidden community in the Northeast Kingdom. Rhett had sent the coordinates from Barry's GPS sync to this user. The user had promised to be there when you arrive. But the deeper they dug, the slipperier it got. VPNs, encrypted apps, IP addresses bouncing through servers in 3 countries. Then, one morning, the profile was gone, deleted entirely. Whether this was a genuine contact who'd panicked, or just an anonymous manipulator playing at something darker. The trail was dead. By late winter, the focus swung back to the physical. Trail, the tracks, the glasses, the way the camp had been left intact. As if someone had walked away in the middle of a breath, CBP shared intelligence on known smuggling routes through the area. One of them, a narrow, nearly invisible corridor, ran less than a mile from the clearing where Wyatt had found the tent. If Rhett and Odessa had been at their fire that night, paired, laughing, unaware, and a smuggler had come along that trail, the timeline could collapse into a single, irreversible encounter. In July, nearly 10 months after the disappearance, the first break in months came from an entirely different corner of the state. A Burlington utility worker filed a routine report noting a 3rd-floor apartment with its windows sealed from the inside, using thick black plastic sheeting. He'd also logged that the electricity usage for the unit was abnormally high. Far above what was typical in most cases, it was the kind of thing that led to a marijuana grow-up bust. But when the report landed on Marlowe's desk during a sweep, for anything that matched smuggling profiles, the name on the lease, Ivan Zorik, set off a different alarm. Zorik had entered the U.S. from Eastern Europe 2 years earlier. No arrests, but plenty of shadows, multiple aliases overseas, and intelligence notes linking him to an organized crime network that CBP suspected of moving drugs, weapons, and human cargo across the Canadian border. The apartment went under surveillance. For 3 weeks, plainclothes officers watched. Zora kept erratic hours, often returning late at night. He switched vehicles regularly, favoring rentals and borrowed sedans. He carried groceries and supplies inside, but no one was ever seen leaving or visiting. He was careful, doubling back, checking his mirrors, pausing in doorways to look over his shoulder. It was enough for a judge to sign a high-risk warrant. Raid went in just before dawn. Inside, the living room was bare. The kitchen was stripped to essentials. The only sound was the low, constant hum of a ventilation system. Then they reached the second bedroom, the one with the reinforced door and multiple external locks. The smell hit them first, metallic and sour. When they forced it open, the beam of the overhead light fell on a figure curled in the corner. Blonde hair matted, skin pale and bruised, ankles chained to a bolted fixture. Odessa Vance, she was rushed to the University of Vermont Medical Center. Her condition critical from dehydration and prolonged malnutrition. It was days before she could speak, when she finally did. Her voice was raw, but steady enough to tell them what happened. They had been at the fire, the stony patch making them loose and slow, when a man stepped out from the darkness, Zorik armed. His voice was clipped, his commands fast. Rhett had tried to fight him, driving the struggle toward the ravine. The glasses had been knocked from his face. Then, in one violent movement, Rhett was gone. Dead before Odessa could even process it. Zorik had chained her in the back of a modified utility vehicle, the same one that had left the tracks and driven her out by the old logging road. The apartment had been ready for her. When Zorik was confronted with her account, he eventually admitted to the killing and the abduction. But when asked about Rhett's body, his eyes went flat, claimed he didn't remember. He was charged with murder, kidnapping, and human trafficking. Convicted on all counts. Sentenced to life without parole, Odessa began the long process of recovery, and somewhere in the wild folds of the Northeast Kingdom, Rhett Kanenkud remained missing. The trial was over. The gavel had fallen, the sentence read aloud, and Ivan Zorik had been led away in shackles without a backward glance. But for Sharon Kanenkade, nothing felt finished. The courtroom's heavy air had done nothing to quiet the question that gnawed at her every waking hour. Where's my son? Jacqueline Vance sat stiffly in the front row that day, Odessa's frail hand in hers. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, avoiding Sharon's entirely. Whatever fragile unity had existed between the two mothers during those first weeks of searching had long since fractured. Jacqueline blamed Rhett for the deception, for the stony patch package in the fire pit, for putting her daughter in the path of a predator. Sharon blamed Zorik, and only Zorik. The divide had grown wider in the courtroom. When Odessa had described in halting detail how Rhett had fought, she had seen him grab for Zorik's arm, try to push him toward the drop. She had heard the thud of bone on rock, and then the silence. It was heroism, Sharon told herself, even as she imagined those final seconds with a clarity that left her. Shaking in the weeks after the verdict, Odessa remained under psychiatric care at the University of Vermont Medical Center. The room was quiet, the blinds drawn halfway to soften the winter light. Visitors were kept to a strict schedule. Detective Marlowe sat across from her one afternoon, a recorder on the table. Odessa's voice was steadier now, but her eyes stayed on her lap. "Can you take me through that night again?" Marlowe asked. Odessa's fingers twisted the edge of her blanket. We'd eaten the gummies. We were just sitting there, laughing. He came from behind me. I didn't even hear him at first. Then he was yelling. "Did you know him?" She shook her head. Never seen him, but he knew the area. Like he knew exactly where he was going. He told Rhett to get on the ground. Rhett wouldn't. Her throat tightened. They went toward the ravine. I heard him go over, like he fell. But it wasn't far. It sounded. She trailed off, swallowed hard.
Oh, yes.
He didn't call back. In the lab downtown, forensics teams had been re-examining every item from the campsite, searching for anything they'd missed. One tech had been focusing on the broken glasses. Under magnification, the fracture on the left arm of the frame showed microstriations consistent not with a fall, but with torsion twisting under force. It wasn't definitive, but it aligned. With Odessa's account of a violent struggle, the utility vehicle track cast had been sent to CBP's regional center, where analysts compared it to a database of seized smuggling rigs. A near match came back from a vehicle confiscated in Quebec. 2 years earlier, same tread pattern, same axle width, Same reinforced undercarriage for rough terrain. The driver in that case had been connected to Zorek's network. The theory was solidifying. Zorek had been moving along his smuggling corridor when he stumbled onto the teenagers. Marlowe wasn't ready to let go of Rhett's trail. She petitioned the Department for Resources to search the ravine again, deeper this time. With cadaver dogs trained for cold cases, the ravine's walls were slick with moss, the floor a tangle of fallen logs and half-buried boulders. The dogs worked in tight circles, noses down, handlers murmuring encouragement. After hours, one of the dogs alerted not to bone, but to fabric. A dark scrap wedged under a stone ledge, waterlogged and frayed. Lab analysis would later confirm. It was consistent with the fibers of the hoodie Rhett had been wearing in the selfie. It wasn't a body, but it was proof he'd made it to the ravine's edge. In Burlington, the apartment where Odessa had been held was stripped bare. The walls of the soundproofed room were peeled back, layer by layer, thick foam, plywood, a lattice of heavy insulation. A hidden compartment was discovered in the ceiling, containing notebooks written in a neat, blocky script. Most were logistical routes, dates, coded notations of quantities. But one entry, dated 2 days after the disappearance, stood out. Problem in sector, removed male. Secured female? Marlowe read it 3 times, each word heavier than the last. Odessa began physiotherapy in early March. Her movements still careful, her weight creeping back slowly. She worked with a trauma counselor twice a week. At first, she wouldn't talk about Rhett at all. Then, one morning, she asked if Sharon could visit. The meeting was quiet. Sharon held her hand and said nothing for a long time. Finally, Odessa whispered, "He didn't let him touch me. Not until." She trailed off, eyes glistening. "He tried so hard. Mrs. Connicade." Sharon squeezed her fingers. "I know." In April, the prosecution filed a request for Zorek's cooperation in recovering Rhett's remains. He refused. Through his attorney, he issued a short statement. "The past is irrelevant. I'm done speaking." The refusal didn't surprise anyone. In prison, Zorek had already aligned himself with other inmates connected to Eastern European syndicates. Word from inside suggested he considered Rhett's death a closed matter. The case file was technically complete, but Marlowe kept it on her desk. She'd begun cross-referencing every missing person report from the border counties. With known smuggling incidents over the past decade, patterns were emerging, sudden disappearances within a mile of suspected routes. Often dismissed as hikers lost or runaways, it was bigger than Rhett and Odessa. And if she could prove it, maybe she could bring the search for Rhett back into active status, stopped by summer. The leaves in the Northeast Kingdom were deep green again, the ravine swallowed in shadow. Sharon returned once alone, standing at the place where the broken glasses had been found. She didn't climb down. She just stood, listening to the wind through the trees, as if it might carry some trace of his voice. Somewhere, she thought, he was still out here. The walls of Marlowe's office had disappeared beneath maps. Thin red lines spidered out from the Vermont-Quebec border, looping through valleys and forest corridors, some ending in small towns, others simply vanishing into blank green. Pushpins dotted the routes, blue for confirmed smuggling incidents, yellow for suspicious activity reports, and black for missing persons cases that had never been solved. The pattern wasn't neat. It never was. But in the clusters of pins, along certain logging roads, Marlowe saw the same thing over and over: disappearances that were too clean to be accidents and too quiet to be random. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. The glow from the desk lamp made the window beside her look like a dark mirror. For months, Rhett's name had been the center of her work. Now she was starting to see him as one thread in a larger, frayed rope. The first connection came from a file dated 3 years earlier. A solo hiker named Paul Renner had vanished during late summer near Canaan, Vermont, less than 20 miles from where Rhett and Odessa had camped. His tent was found fully intact, gear still inside, as if he'd stepped out for a moment and never come back. No sign of struggle, no tracks. 2 weeks after Renner's disappearance, Border Patrol sensors had picked up unusual vehicle activity on an unmonitored stretch of forest road 6 miles north. The incident had been noted and filed, but no connection was made, till now. Marlowe pinned Renner's photo next to Rhett's on the wall. 2 different years, 2 similar vanishings, both within walking distance of suspected smuggling corridors. She began calling the families of other missing persons from her growing list. Some were hesitant. Years of silence had hardened into resignation. Others still wanted answers. One woman, whose brother had disappeared in 2015, told Marlowe she'd always believed someone took him. He'd been camping in a spot he wouldn't tell anyone about, the woman said over the phone. Said it was the quietest place he'd ever been. I think he saw something he shouldn't have. The Vermont State Police didn't have unlimited resources for cold cases. But Marlowe found an ally in CBP agent Derek Salvo. Salvo had been patrolling the border for 12 years and knew its soft spots like the lines in his palm. When she showed him her map, he studied it for a long moment before tapping 3 black pins with his finger. These routes, he said, are not just for drugs. They're pipelines. They move whatever needs moving. And if you're missing folks, we're anywhere near them? He didn't finish the sentence. By early September, Marlowe's theory had taken shape. She believed that Rhett had been one of several civilians who'd accidentally crossed paths with active smuggling runs, and that Zorik was only one of multiple operators. The implication was chilling. If Rhett's body hadn't been found, it might be because it had been disposed of in a manner consistent with operational security, hidden in places designed to stay hidden. She requested access to aerial drone footage from the week Rhett vanished. Focusing on the Northeast Kingdom sector, hours of footage played on her monitor, treetops swaying, empty logging roads, the occasional moose wandering between shadows. Then, on a grainy clip, time-stamped 2 nights after the disappearance. She saw it, a narrow vehicle with a tarp-covered bed, headlights blacked out, moving along the same overgrown road where the tire tracks had been cast. The footage was too poor to identify the driver. But the wheelbase matched the measurements from the plaster cast exactly. Meanwhile, Odessa was making slow progress in recovery. She had begun giving more detailed statements to her trauma counselor, which Marlowe attended with her permission. One session, Odessa mentioned something new. When he was driving me out, she said quietly, "We passed. I think it was another truck. They didn't stop, but they slowed down. The driver looked at me. I'll never forget his face. Asked her to work with a sketch artist. The result was a weathered man with close-cropped hair and a deep scar along his jawline. CBP recognized him immediately, a Quebec-based runner named Luc Garnier, suspected of working with the same syndicate as Zorik. The sketch was enough to open a joint investigation with Canadian authorities. Garnier had been active in cross-border smuggling for years, but had never been caught with product, how Marlowe believed. He might also have knowledge of what happened to Rhett. A warrant was issued for his arrest on trafficking charges, but Garnier vanished before it could be served. His cabin in Quebec was found empty, a coffee cup still half full on the counter. For Sharon Conincade, the news that another man might be involved was a fresh wound. She met with Marlowe in the station one rainy evening, the maps of the Northeast Kingdom still spread across the detective's desk. "If this Garnier knows anything," Sharon began, "he's running. But running men leave trails, and I'm not done following them." October, Marlowe and Salvo conducted a targeted sweep of the ravine area with new ground-penetrating radar equipment. Hoping to find hidden burial sites nearby, they found anomalies, pockets in the earth that didn't match the natural terrain, but excavation revealed nothing more than old, collapsed animal dens. Still, each failed search deepened Marlowe's conviction. Rhett's body hadn't been left in the ravine. It had been moved. 2 weeks later, a hunter called in from a ridge 5 miles north of the campsite. He'd stumbled across a shallow depression under a cluster of hemlocks. Inside were bones, animal, at first glance, but tangled in the roots. Was a strip of dark fabric that, once tested, proved to be cotton polyester blend with traces of human DNA. The match came back partial. It was consistent with Rhett's. Sharon was told in person. She didn't cry. She only nodded once and asked, "Where exactly?" When Marlowe pointed to the map, the black pin was already there. The first frost came early that year, turning the high ridges of the Northeast Kingdom silver before dawn. In the Vermont State Police's Joint Operations Room, the air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and the scratch of pens over maps. Detective Marlowe stood at the head of the table, while CBP agent Derek Scalvo and two officers from the Screet du Quebec leaned in over satellite photos. A red grease pencil line traced the suspected smuggling route, beginning near the overgrown logging road by Rhett's campsite, cutting north through dense spruce forest and crossing the border at a narrow gap in the customs fence before. Winding into the Laurentian foothills? That's Garnia's corridor, Salvo said, tapping the map. If Zorik was moving product the night he found the kids, Garnia might have been the one running backup. The Quebec officers nodded grimly. They'd been chasing Luc Garnier for almost a decade. A man who slipped between borders as easily as a shadow slipped between trees. The partial DNA match from the Hemlock burial site had changed the tone of the case. It was enough to suggest Rhett's remains had been moved deliberately, that the site was nothing more than a temporary dump. Bodies don't get relocated unless somebody's worried they'll be found, Marlowe said in the meeting. That means someone came back here. Maybe days later, maybe weeks, which means the trail doesn't end at the ravine. Canadian authorities provided intelligence on Garnia's movements in the months after Rhett's disappearance. Two sightings stood out. One in early October 2018, near Saint-Hermenegilde, Quebec, a border village less than 6 miles from the logging road. In another in late December, in a remote Laurentian township known for off-grid cabins. Both were within reach of the suspected smuggling corridor. Marlowe stared at the timeline. If we believe Odessa, she said. Then Garnier saw her in Zorik's truck, which means he knew she was alive and he knew Rhett wasn't. By mid-November, a small Vermont-Quebec task force had formed. Their first objective was to find Garnier's cabin, last seen in the December sighting. Snow had already fallen and the Laurentians thick enough to bury tire tracks in hours. The cabin wasn't on any public record. It took 2 weeks of combing. Aerial imagery before they spotted it, a narrow structure barely visible through fir trees. Roof patched with corrugated tin, no visible road access. When they reached it by snowmobile, it was empty. The inside smelled of cold ash and diesel. A rusted pot sat on a wood stove, the water inside frozen solid. But in the corner, they found a half-collapsed duffel bag. Inside was a tarp, rope, and a small folding shovel, all with traces of dark staining. The bag was sent for analysis. Within a week, the stains tested positive for human blood. Partial DNA again matched Rhett. The discovery ignited Sharon Conancade's hope and dread in equal measure. She met with Marlowe in the dimly lit hallway outside the forensics lab. If that's his blood, then... Sharon began. It tells us he was moved, Marlowe said carefully. But it doesn't tell us where to. Quebec police widened their search grid from the cabin. Following terrain that could be navigated by the kind of narrow wheelbase vehicles Garnier favored, they found old tire impressions under the snowpack, pressed into the frozen mud months earlier. Heading toward an abandoned mica quarry 10 miles north. The quarry was a yawning wound in the forest. Rimmed with sheer stone walls, ice clung to the ledges. The water at the bottom was black and still, a mirror reflecting the gray winter sky. Divers were brought in, their breath steaming in the cold air. They found nothing in the first 3 days. On the 4th, a diver surfaced holding a scrap of maroon fabric. Later tests confirmed it was from the hoodie Rhett had been wearing in the selfie he'd sent Sharon before the trip. The quarry deepened the mystery. Why move a body from Vermont into Quebec just to hide it in a half-frozen pit? Salvo's theory was simple, because once it's across the line, it's our jurisdiction, not yours. And smuggling crews know how to use that gap. The hunt for Garnier tightened in late December when a tip came from a snowplow driver in Mégantic County. He'd seen a man matching Garnier's description refueling at an unmanned gas pump. Paying in cash, face hidden under a balaclava, Quebec police set up roadblocks, but Garnier vanished again. Disappearing into the maze of logging trails that crisscrossed the borderland, Marlowe refused to let the trail die. She and Salvo began working from the assumption that Garnier still had contact with other members of Zorich's network. The breakthrough came not from border patrols, but from a seized phone in an unrelated drug raid in Sherbrooke. Among the encrypted messages was a string of coordinates sent from an unknown number, coordinates that mapped to a point less than a mile from the quarry. The last message, translated from French, read simply, "Nettoyer la zone, clean the area." Marlowe sat with the printout of the message late one night, the station almost empty around her. It wasn't proof, it was close. If they could tie Garnier to that cleanup order, it might lead them not just to Rhett's final resting place, but to a larger network that had been burying more than just contraband in the forest between Vermont and Quebec, and for the first time in months, she felt the case's momentum tilt forward. The message, "Nettoyer la zone," sat like a stone in the middle of the case file. Translated, it was simple. But in the context of smuggling routes, temporary burial sites, and missing people, it was anything but. Detective Marlowe pinned the printout on the board next to the quarry photos. She drew a thin red line from it to Garnier's name. "If this is him," she told the Joint Vermont-Quebec Task Force, "then he's not just moving contraband. He's cleaning up evidence, and not the kind that comes in plastic wrap." CBP. Agent Salvo agreed. If he got an order to clean the area, it means somebody up the chain was worried about what was still there. Could have been gear, could have been remains. Could have been Rhett, Marlowe said quietly. The problem was, Garnier was still a ghost. The December sighting at the unmanned pump had been the last confirmed glimpse. He could have been sleeping rough in the woods, staying in safe houses across the border, or hiding in plain sight in a small Quebec town. Then an unexpected lead came from the other end of his network. A petty smuggler named Emile Toussaint, arrested in Vermont. On a stolen TV charge, claimed he had information worth trading. He'd been running low-grade product for Garnier to summers earlier and still had contacts in the network. In the small interview room, under the thin hum of fluorescent lights, Toussaint leaned forward. "They'll never catch him by chasing him," he said. "He's too smart for that. You have to let him come to you." "And how do we do that?" Marlowe asked. Toussaint's eyes flicked toward the observation window. "You put someone inside, someone who can buy his trust. You'll need bait he can't resist." The bait turned out to be information false, but convincing about a stash of confiscated goods supposedly left unguarded in a storage yard near the Vermont border. Toussaint agreed to be the go-between, passing the tip through his old contacts. It was risky. If Garnier suspected a setup, the operation could collapse before it began. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then, on a wet March morning, a call came in from a Quebec surveillance unit. A man matching Garnier's description had been spotted on a feeder road outside Stanhope, driving a narrow utility vehicle with the same wheelbase as the plaster cast. Tracks from Vermont, the team tailed him at a distance. Garnier didn't go near the supposed storage yard. Instead, he drove straight north toward the Laurentian foothills. Vanishing onto a trail not marked on any map, Marlowe, Salvo, and 2 Quebec officers followed on snowmobiles. The trail wound between pines and over frozen creeks, then opened into a clearing where the snow had been churned into gray slush. In the center stood Garnier's utility vehicle, engines still warm. The man himself was nowhere in sight. They fanned. "Out!" 30 yards into the trees, Salvo called out. He'd found a disturbed patch of snow over a shallow pit. Inside was a bundle wrapped in heavy black plastic, weighted with 2 stones. The bundle was carried out under a silent sky in the forensics lab. Technicians unwrapped the plastic. Inside was a rotted canvas duffel, the seams dark with soil. Beneath it, bone fragments. Not a full skeleton, not even close, but enough for DNA. Within a week, the lab confirmed. The fragments matched Rhett Conacade. The call to Sharon came just after 9 p.m. She didn't ask how much they'd found, or where. She just said, "Thank you for bringing him back to me." But for Marlowe, the job wasn't done. Garnier had left the bundle in a clearing miles from any road. That meant he had a larger site, a main disposal ground somewhere else. If they could find They might not only close Rhett's case completely, but also uncover the fates of others who'd vanished along those same smuggling lines. 2 days later, the surveillance unit caught a break. A wildlife camera in a Quebec game reserve, placed to monitor moose migration, had captured Garnia's utility vehicle passing through at dawn. In the background, barely visible, was a stack of rough-cut timbers, forming what looked like the mouth of a covered pit. Marlowe stared at the still image on the monitor. "That's it," she said. "That's where the rest of him is. And maybe more." The still frame from the wildlife camera stayed on the screen long after the meeting ended. The shape in the background, the rough timbers, the dark opening beneath, was impossible to mistake once you'd seen it. Covered pits were a relic in these forests, built decades ago by loggers or trappers, but this one looked maintained. Too neat, too deliberate. Detective Marlowe traced the timestamp with her finger. Dawn, mid-March. Garnia's utility vehicle. Coming from the north? No other sightings in the past month? He's going there to deposit something, CBP agent Salvo said quietly, or to make sure what's already there stays hidden. The Secret du Quebec agreed to move quickly. The site was inside a provincial game reserve, which meant they had to navigate layers of bureaucracy to authorize an incursion. By the time all the signatures were on paper, a week had passed. Enough time, they feared, for Garnia to return and clear it out. They went in before sunrise. Snowmobiles carried the joint task force along frozen ridges, their engines muffled with suppressors to avoid spooking game or alerting anyone who might be listening. The trail from the camera was faint but still readable in the packed snow. Narrow tread marks heading deeper into the pines. 2 kilometers in, the trees thinned. The smell hit first. Faint, sweet, and unmistakable to anyone who had worked crime scenes long enough. The pit was exactly where the camera had caught it. The timbers across the opening had been pulled back, and a thin crust of ice clung to the edges. Someone had thrown branches over the top in a half-hearted attempt to disguise it. The forensic team worked methodically. The pit was about 6 feet deep, the bottom lined with frozen earth and partially thawed muck. They cleared it layer by layer, bagging everything, soil, organic debris, the first small bones they uncovered. Then came the clothing, a faded flannel shirt, a boot with the sole separating, scraps of denim. None matched Rhett's known clothing. That didn't mean they weren't connected. By midday, they'd recovered skeletal remains belonging to at least 2 individuals. One set was significantly smaller, likely a female, the other judging. By the femur length was an adult male. Marlowe stood at the edge of the pit, her breath clouding in the cold air. "This isn't just a dump site," she said. "It's a graveyard." Remains were flown to Montreal for forensic analysis. Within 2 weeks, they confirmed the male was Paul Renner, the hiker who had vanished in 2015 near Canaan, Vermont, one of the black pins on Marlowe's map. The female matched the description of a missing Quebec woman last seen hitchhiking. In 2016, the discovery made headlines in both countries, and it raised an urgent question. How many others were out there? Garnier, meanwhile, remained elusive. The game reserve sweep had been done quietly, but word travels fast in smuggling networks. If he'd caught wind that the pit was compromised, he'd be on the move again or gone for good. The Quebec officers suggested laying a trap. Feed him false information about a safe new burial site and wait for him to check it. In April, they seeded the rumor through the same channels that had carried the storage yard story months earlier. For days, nothing. Then, on the 5th night, a sensor hidden along a narrow ridgeline trail tripped a utility vehicle heading south toward the border. Marlowe and Salvo were already in the air, flown by helicopter to a clearing ahead of the trail. The sound of the vehicle came first, low and steady. Then it emerged between the trees, the same narrow wheelbase, the same black tarp lashed to the back. The stop was clean. Garnier was taken without a shot fired, though the look in his eyes promised nothing but silence in the interrogation room. And silent he was for nearly 48 hours. Then, in the 3rd session, after being shown the photographs of the pit and the remains, his composure cracked just enough for him to say one thing. "That's not the only one." That's not the only one. The words hung in the small interrogation room, heavy enough to still the scratching pen of the stenographer behind the glass. Garnia's tone was flat, almost bored, but the way his eyes fixed on Marlowe told her it wasn't an idle bluff. "How many?" she asked. He smirked, leaning back in the chair. "More than you've got time for." It took another 2 hours, and the promise of certain concessions in custody to get him to draw 3 small X's on a map of the borderland. None were near the game reserve pit. I sat deep in the Vermont side of the forest, another in a stretch of crown land in Quebec, and the third in a narrow gulch bisected by a river that marked the borderline itself. "They're old," he said. "Tapping one of the marks might be nothing left." The task force split into 3 teams. Marlowe insisted on taking the Vermont site herself. It was reachable only by hiking 5 miles in from the nearest forest road, the trail fading into uneven, root-choked ground. The X had been placed near a stand of spruce so dense that the canopy blotted out most of the daylight. The soil was spongy with decades of fallen needles. The cadaver dogs picked up a scent within minutes. A shallow depression, camouflaged with moss and sticks, yielded a scattering of bones, ribs, vertebrae, and a jaw with 2 teeth still intact. The dental records would later confirm they belonged to a man reported missing from New Hampshire in 2012. Meanwhile, the Quebec team at the Crown Land site uncovered another covered pit, this one partially collapsed. Inside were the remains of at least 3 individuals, mixed together in the soil like discarded trash. The gulch site was the hardest to reach. The river ran fast and cold, fed by snowmelt, and the banks were slick with mud. It was Salvo's team that made the find, a rusted metal drum half buried in silt, sealed tight with a corroded lid. When they pried it open, the stench rolled out like a living thing. Inside were bones wrapped in a rotted tarp, along with scraps of clothing, so degraded they crumbled at a touch. The tally was grim. Between all 3 sites, they recovered the remains of 7 individuals. 3 were quickly matched to open missing persons cases. The rest were still unidentified, and yet still no full set of Rhett's remains. The fragments from the clearing in Quebec were all they had. Back in the interview room, Marlowe laid out photographs of each site in front of Garnier. "Why not him?" she asked. "Why didn't you bury Rhett in one of these?" Garnier's gaze slid over the pictures without flinching. "Not my choice," he said. "Zurich handled that one." That single line shifted the axis of the case. Zurich, even in prison, still held the last piece of Rhett's story. Arranging to see him wasn't simple. He was housed in a maximum security facility, his movements strictly controlled. When Marlowe finally sat across from him in the sterile visitation room, he looked almost amused. "I told you before," he said. "I don't remember." "You remember enough to kill him?" Marlowe said. For a long time he said nothing. Then, almost idly, he spoke. "Bodies are easy to hide up there, harder when someone wants them found." It was a taunt. But it also carried something else. The suggestion that Rhett's final resting place wasn't about concealment at all, but about sending a message. 2 weeks later, that theory was tested when a lone hiker stumbled on a human femur wedged between rocks in a shallow stream 10 miles north of the campsite. The bone was clean, bleached by sun and water, and it was lying in plain view. DNA confirmed it was Rhett's. If it had been placed there, it wasn't meant to stay hidden. It was meant to be found. For Sharon, the news was devastating in a different way. She'd clung to the idea of bringing her son home whole. Now she knew there were parts of him she'd never recover, pieces scattered across a landscape that had swallowed others long before him. The femur lay in an evidence tray under bright lab lights, its pale surface still beaded with water from the stream. Marlowe stood over it, hands in her pockets, staring as if the bone might yield something beyond the DNA report clipped to its side. It wasn't just the location that gnawed at her, 10 miles north of the campsite. Far from the ravine where Odessa last saw Rhett, it was the fact that it had been in open view, wedged between 2 stones like a signpost no one could miss. If it had washed downstream, there should have been more. If it had been carried there, By animals, the rest of the remains should have been nearby. But there was nothing. Which meant, to Marlowe's mind, someone had put it there. She brought the bone into the incident room and laid it on the central table. Alongside the other fragments, the maroon hoodie scrap from the quarry, the partial remains from the clearing, the blood-stained duffel from Garnia's cabin. Around them, she pinned photographs, GPS maps, and Odessa's own words, pulled from interview transcripts into a rough chronology. Everything we have, she told the team, points to movement. Rhett's body didn't stay in one place. He was taken from the ravine. Parts of him ended up at a temporary site. Then some of him was moved across the border, and this bone was left as a marker. The question was why. Salvo's theory was blunt. It's a message. Someone in Zorich's network wanted law enforcement to know they could drop evidence anywhere. Anytime, it's intimidation. But Marlowe suspected there was more. Whoever placed the femur had taken a risk, traveling into territory already under heightened surveillance, leaving behind physical evidence that could be traced. Which meant the gesture wasn't just intimidation, it was personal. She turned back to Odessa's testimony. In the last session, Odessa had mentioned something she'd never said before. When Zorich dragged me to the truck, he was talking to someone on a radio. He said, "We've got a problem. The boy's not done. Not done, Marlowe." Repeated when Odessa told her. "You mean not dead?" Odessa nodded. "I think so." His voice was urgent, like he wanted to get away fast. If Rhett had survived the initial struggle, even briefly, it could explain the movement. He might have been injured, transported, and died later, somewhere along the route north. That would make his remains both evidence and liability, forcing the smugglers to break him up across multiple sites. It was a grim theory, but it fit. Marlowe pulled traffic sensor data from the border sector for the 2 days after the disappearance. Most hits were animals, but one anomaly caught her eye: a single narrow wheelbase. Vehicle moving north past a hidden trail camera at 4:13 a.m., 2 nights after Rhett and Odessa vanished. The tarp covering the back sagged heavily as if weighed down, the time stamp lined up almost exactly with the suspected window when Zorich would have been moving Odessa into the Burlington apartment. Which meant someone else, possibly Garnier, could have been moving Rhett. Back in interrogation, Garnier confirmed nothing. But when Marlowe mentioned the femur's placement, he smiled. Not the cocky smirk he'd worn before, but something smaller, almost nostalgic. "Sometimes," he said, "things need to be remembered." It was enough for Marlowe to put the last pieces together. Friday evening, Rhett and Odessa arrive at the clearing, set up camp, and start the fire. They consume the Stony Patch edibles. Later that night, Zorich stumbles on the camp while running the corridor. Confrontation at the UHS ravine. Rhett is injured, possibly fatally, but still alive when Zorich contacts his network. Early Saturday, Rhett is handed off to Garnier, who moves him north. He dies en route. Over the next week, Rhett's remains are split, some to the clearing pit, some to the quarry, some disposed of elsewhere. Months later, the femur is deliberately placed in the stream. The timeline didn't give Sharon the closure she wanted, but it gave her something else. The knowledge that her son had fought, had lived beyond the first blow, and that his death wasn't an instant erasure. Someone cared enough to make sure we found part of him. She said quietly to Marlowe. Whether that care came from guilt, respect, or a darker motive, Marlowe couldn't say. But it was enough to keep the file open. Officially cold, but never closed. Spring came late to the borderlands that year. Snow clung to the north slopes into May, and meltwater filled the gullies until they sang with cold, fast streams. For the first time in months, the air in the Vermont State Police incident room carried something lighter, not relief. Exactly. But the steady quiet of work moving toward its end. The Joint Task Force had one objective left: to search the last possible burial sites named by Garnier. 2 of them had already been excavated, yielding unidentified remains. The third, an overgrown hillside above a disused timber road on the Quebec side, had been too frozen to reach in winter. They went in on the first. Mild morning after the thaw, the hillside was steep, the loam soft underfoot. For the first 100 yards, there was nothing but old treefall and deer scat. Then one of the cadaver dogs stiffened, nose low, tail rigid. Beneath a layer of rotted leaves and branches, they found a narrow trench, just long enough for a body. The soil inside was darker, richer, disturbed not long before the first freeze. When the forensic team lifted the top layers, they uncovered a partial skeleton, still wearing the remains of a boot and the shredded cuff of a maroon hoodie. Ow, DNA. Confirmed what Marlowe already knew in her gut. It was Rhett. The news reached Sharon that afternoon. She sat for a long time at her kitchen table, hands folded before saying, "Now I can bring him home." The remains were released to her a week later. The funeral was small, quiet, held under the same slate-gray sky that had hung over the ravine. Searched the previous winter. Odessa was there, pale but steadier, clutching a single white rose. When the service ended, she stayed back as the others drifted toward their cars. "I wanted to tell you," she said to Sharon. He never stopped trying. Even when he was hurt, he was thinking about you. Sharon's eyes shone, but she only nodded. "I know." Garnia, faced with the full weight of the remains, recovered, pled out to avoid a trial. He received a life sentence in Quebec for multiple counts of homicide, in addition to trafficking charges. Zorich's sentence remained unchanged, though the additional bodies tied to his corridor ensured he would never see daylight again. For Marlowe, closing Rhett's case didn't mean clearing the board. The photographs of the unidentified remains stayed pinned to the wall above her desk, a black pin still scattered across the map. She knew there were names that would never be matched, families that would never get a call. But for Sharon Canoncade, at least, the waiting was over. Odessa left Vermont in early summer. She moved in with an aunt in Maine, enrolled in community college, and began volunteering at a shelter for women in crisis. She didn't speak publicly about what had happened, but she kept in touch with Marlowe, sending brief updates every few months. In one letter she wrote, "Sometimes I dream about that night. But lately it's not the part where he took us. It's before, when we were just sitting by the fire. I try to stay there as long as I can." The ravine grew quiet again, swallowed by green. The campsite where the tent had stood was just another patch of earth under the spruce. The forest had a way of keeping its secrets. But that spring, one more had been given up. Marlowe hiked there once more before the case file went into storage. She stood at the edge, the wind in the branches sounding almost like voices far below. Not all the missing would be found, she knew. Not all the dead would be named. But Rhett had made it home, and in the work she did, that counted for something. She turned back toward the trail, leaving the forest to close in behind her.